Welcome to the History in 60 podcast, a companion series to AMI's History in 60, hosted by John Loeppky, exploring powerful moments in Canada's disability history. Here on the podcast, we take a deeper dive through conversations with guests who are shaping disability culture and history today.
The Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms is often seen as one of Canada's most important achievements when it comes to human rights. But what many people don't realize is that when the Charter was first being drafted, disabled people were left out of the equality protections altogether. It took years of advocacy, organizing, and individuals willing to challenge this country's governments to get to a point where disabled advocates and disabled voices could become part of that Charter conversation. Our guest today is Heather McCain, a disability advocate and Crip Doula, whose work centers around community care, cultural knowledge, and self-advocacy. Heather works at the intersection of disability justice, collective care, intersectionality, lived experience, and supporting disabled people through moments of transition while helping preserve and pass on knowledge within disability communities. Thanks so much for joining us on the History in 60 Companion Podcast. Thank you for joining me, Heather. Just as we get started, could you give me a little bit of a description of where you are in space for lovely integrated described video?
So I am in my living room / bedroom. I have a big yellow quilt behind me and some crystals that are hanging above my head and pride flag on my bed.
Perfect. Thank you. And, for these interviews, we always ask folks what their sort of community title is, and that's really relevant to our conversation today. Could you run me through that as well?
Sure. So I'm the founder and executive director of Live, Educate, Transform Society, and the title I'm proudest of is Crip Doula, which is a disability justice term for a disabled person who helps other disabled people navigate our complex systems, build resources, support, and community.
Can you tell us a little bit about your work when it comes to disability advocacy and how you grew into this sort of Crip Doula identity?
Sure. So the summer after graduation, my body kind of started falling apart, and it would take 6 years to get medical professionals to take me serious and get a diagnosis of multiple arthritises and a connective tissue disorder. And it was a really isolating experience. And so I sought out community by starting a chronic pain support group. I started using a wheelchair and I thought that would mean freedom, but unfortunately bus drivers would lie at least half of the time and say that the ramps were broken because they didn't want to bother loading and unloading someone in a wheelchair. And so I wrote letter after letter to TransLink, our transit authority, with no response. And I couldn't find any organizations who wanted to support me. And someone in my group jokingly said I should start my own organization. So I did. I wrote the exact same letter to TransLink, but with executive director under my name, and got a response a week later. I was able to address that situation, and I've been a consultant for them for the past 20 years. I then started writing a monthly column for a local paper on a different person with a different disability for 5 years. I did disability awareness training and accessibility audits. And 20 years later, I continue to be led by the needs of community. We now have over a dozen workshops and are beginning to put them online. And in the last 7 years, we've become a lot more intersectional, wanting to represent the wholeness of a person. Everyone at our organization is disabled and or neurodivergent, and most of us are also 2S LGBTQI+.
Thank you. And as I understand it, Crip Doula is sort of a title that gets bestowed upon you in a way, or not something that people tend to automatically claim. Can you talk to me a little bit about how you came to find the word, and also who in the community were you connected to as you were building into that?
Yeah, so I was running a group called Chronically Queer, a group that we still facilitate. It's a peer support group for 2S LGBTQI+ people who have chronic health conditions. It was through this group that I began to be called a Crip Doula. You are correct. It is a term that is kind of bestowed upon you by a community who felt the positive effects of your work. Corin Parsons was the first person to call me a Crip Doula. Corin is a Crip, queer, and trans person. They've taught me so much about Crip and Crip history from an academic perspective. They also gave me one of my favorite compliments. Corin said I have a lot of bippity boppity boo, referring to the godmother from Cinderella. He said that because whenever he had a question about disability, I had an answer or resource. He even gave me a magic wand that I still have. One Christmas, he actually sent me a text that said, "Thank you for your hard work on behalf of our community, for your bippity boppity, for giving me a model of Crip badassery to which to aspire, and for being a good friend. And if people like Corin think I'm a badass Crip, then I must be doing something right."
I'm realizing that maybe for some of our audience, our use of Crip may be sort of new to them, or maybe they haven't heard it 8 times in 2 sentences between the two of us. So wondering if you, from your perspective, because everybody I think has a different definition of what Crip means to them, wondering if you could sort of define that for us.
There's so many different ways to talk about Crip because it can be academic. There's a movement behind it. It's short for cripple, and it's a way to reclaim a term, much as like the queer community has done with the term queer, or the MAD movement has done with the term MAD. It's reclaiming something that was once used against us and building empowerment into it. And the term Crip Doulaing was actually developed in conversations between disability justice advocates Leah Lakshmi Piepsana Sarasima and Stacey Park Milburn for Leah's book Care Work, Dreaming Disability Justice. Milburn said that Crip Doulaing was the process by which disabled people mentor other disabled people in learning new disabled skills, from how to drive a wheelchair and negotiate with care attendants to how to have sex. And Milburn said that until she invented the term in 2017, there was no word to describe this process of disabled to disabled mentorship and skill sharing. And she said that if you don't have the words for something, it's hard to do it or imagine it's possible. So Crip is different from disability or disabled in that there's a political history to it. To Crip something is like to indigenize something, right? Like there's a movement behind it. And for me, it's really empowering and a way to look at things like Crip time, which is a theory about how time for people with disabilities moves differently, whether it is that you may leave your house later in life, or that sometimes, like for myself, I kind of aged earlier because I was experiencing disability in my 20s. And so there's a lot of different things that are wrapped up within Crip.
The TV episode that this podcast is connected to is talking about how disabled people fought and allies fought to be part of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. I'm just curious how you find disability history filtering into the conversations you have as a Crip doula, because when we created the show, part of the thing me and my collaborators were rebelling against in a way is the fact that I find a lot of disabled folks, often through no fault of their own, don't know their history and the histories of our community. So I'm curious how that filters into your work.
Yeah, honestly, I don't hear much about disability history, and that's why we developed our disability history workshop. There's such a lack of understanding of the history of disabled people, institutionalization, lack of access, all the amazing advocates and leaders who've worked for decades and continue to gain us the rights and access that we have. An example is that here in Vancouver, I often drive by the site of Woodlands, which is an asylum that was built in, I think, 1878 and closed in 1996 after years of allegations of various abuse. There's over 3,000 residents of Woodlands that are buried in the cemetery next to it. And there's such a horrible kind of history to it. And there's now a garden and a sculpture with pillars that have the names of some of the people who died there. But I very rarely hear about this history. And people often think that history was a long time ago. But Woodlands is an example of, the settlement wasn't even approved till 2010. So we've made huge strides. But part of my work is both within the queer and disability community is to really learn whose lives led to those strides and honor their memory, and also celebrate the current advocates that continue to do their work.
When you're creating a resource like that, it sounds trite, but what are you thinking about when you're creating a resource like that within the context of sort of welcoming folks into disability experience? I always think of Crip doulaship as like creating the softest landing one can. Doesn't mean the landing is going to be soft, but lessening the blow sometimes.
When I create resources like that, I kind of have a push and pull with the present and the past, in that we're also living in a future that people in history could not have imagined. And an example is the MAD movement. MAD identity is deeply personal to me as a neurodivergent and MAD individual leading a disability and neurodivergent focused organization. But my perspective is also really shaped by my grandma, who was a psychiatric survivor, whose experiences at the psychiatric hospital still resonate within our family. And for example, at one point, she was being admitted to a psych hospital, and the doctor pressured my grandpa to sign papers erasing her rights so they could experiment on her. And the direct quote they said was that she had more value to science than she ever would to family. And so when I talk about the MAD definition,
That's a hard thing to sit with.
it is. I'd only seen my grandpa cry twice in his life, once about the loss of his son and once as he was recalling that. And, you know, when you take your wife to a place where you're hoping to get her help and that is the response that you receive, that's super difficult. And so when I talk about the MAD definition, she's forefront in my mind. Like, the grandma I knew was just pure, unconditional love, kind and compassionate. And it honestly amazes me that some of the kindest and softest and most beautiful souls are those who have suffered under systems that fail to see their humanity and value. Fortunately, my grandma did get a good decade at the end of her life, thanks to a doctor who took her seriously and medications that helped. She passed in the 90s, but I still have conversations with her. I tell her about the MAD movement and all that psychiatric survivors have done to ensure people don't experience that trauma she did. And using history to create a better now and future matters to me, to survivors, to their families and loved ones, and to those whose lives were tragically undervalued, disregarded, and are lost. So that is one part of the Crip Doulaing for me, is like creating that future that people can't imagine for themselves. And then the other is that soft landing, is when I became disabled at 17, I had no idea how to be disabled. There is no book on how to be disabled.
No.
And it was through community. You know, thankfully, I got involved in adaptive sports. And so I figured out, like, where do you get the contractors who can, you know, redo my basement suite to make it accessible? Where do I buy mobility devices? Where do I figure out where the resources are? And so part of Crip Doulaing is helping guide people with that information, creating peer support groups where they can come and talk about their frustrations openly in an environment where people aren't going to say, have you tried yoga? Have you tried physio? Have you tried this? Or you should do this, you know, but a place where you can come and there's a grieving process for people who have acquired disabilities, because you're grieving the life you had and the life you thought you were going to have. And I think it's really important as you go through that grieving process to be around people who have created a life that they're proud of, so that you can see that your life may not turn out like you imagined, but that doesn't mean that it can't have lots of fulfillment within it. Like, I definitely did not think 20 years down the road that I would still be running this organization. And honestly, thinking about my life had I not had a disability and the life that I have now, like, I can't imagine anything else. And I think it helps other people to see that you can create something that you're proud of, but also be realistic to the barriers and systemic issues and ableism that you're going to face, because having a disability is not all rosiness. You know, like, that fulfillment comes from things that you're doing for yourself, from community, but it comes with a cost of having to deal with a society and systems that are still not built for or by disabled people.
Yeah, to your point earlier, the sort of oftentimes the folks who have been hit the hardest with things like systemic ableism and violence related to their disability are the kindest. And also, I find it interesting how we can balance in community this sort of, like, it is a pure, I don't know if natural is the right word, but it's a natural reaction to a lot of these experiences to become the sort of stereotypical bitter cripple. And yet so often, you know, finding space for that joy, I've certainly found, even within this episode about the charter, finding space for where community could come together and fight for what they wanted to be included in the charter was a huge part of that.
For sure. And when I first had my disability and sought out community, I went to a disability group, and it was all older people, and they were bitter and they were competing about who had it worse, and it depressed the hell out of me. And I was like, no, I can't, this can't be like my future, right? And so that's why I originally created that chronic pain support group. Like, I couldn't fade into the wallpaper enough. I was not someone who would put myself out there. And so it was a huge move for me to like create this group. And I was convinced no one would show up. And we had 41 people at the first meeting. We were the only group in BC for a long time that had pretty even gender. Like, usually a lot of support groups are skewed to female. But we really used humor and openness. And so we had, more than one gender, which was awesome. Because we had other perspectives. It was a really, really good group, and that ran for 8 years. And it was nice to create something that was different from what I saw. And it spoke to a lot of the people who came there because, they didn't want to go down that. There was enough negativeness around us. We didn't need to kind of like feed into that.
In the episode that this is a companion podcast to, David Loeppky made this point, who was one of the lead advocates, arguing in front of committees for disability inclusion as part of protections, as part of the charter. And one of the points he made is that at the time, we can sometimes take this sort of grassroots, the ability to talk to each other through a digital form like we are right now, even though I'm in our podcast studio in Saskatoon and you're in BC. But that at the time, there was much less grassroots. It couldn't come together as easily. And so he makes this point about the difference between sort of grassroots organizing and these sort of top-down, my word, not his, but sort of legalistic approaches, like fighting at the top of the funnel, so to speak. And I'm curious your thoughts on the power of grassroots organizing and also the limitations of grassroots organizing when it comes to disability justice work.
Yeah, I think one thing that's overlooked a lot when it comes to grassroots organizing is that mutual aid has kept disabled people alive. The systems have failed us, and it's community that has kept us going. That community doesn't just have to be from the disability community, right? It's community coming together to support people with disabilities, and that mutual aid has been around, even before the internet. And so there have been ways that people have shown up for each other. The grassroots organizing that we do now is definitely more widespread, and people who are more isolated can still access that community, which is awesome because of technology. And I really see that within the neurodivergent community, where so many people have learned more about neurodivergence from social media than they have from medical professionals or, their schools. And so it's a huge tool. The top-down approach is important. We need our rights. We need to have the ability to gather, to go to school. Like, that's all really important. But I feel like the grassroots feeds the top-down approach, and the two, you can't really have one without the other. It's community that is informing community of what are our needs, what are our rights, what are we fighting for. And I think there's been so much support from a grassroots perspective, even for the legal fights. And for disabled people, especially, some of the legal fights are so long and arduous, and just like talking to another disabled person who is like, thank you very much for doing this, it really matters to me, that keeps the legal cases continuing, right? It really encourages people to stick through when you hear from families, when you hear from people about what a win would mean for them, or even just what the representation means to them, to be able to see the conversation in the news, to be able to see someone like themselves and their experiences represented. And so I think you can't really have one without the other, but they definitely have different complementary positions.
From my experience, I often feel this divide between young / newly injured. You don't always become disabled when you're young, and those born with it, old guard, when it comes to community knowledge. Do you feel that divide and tension? And how do you think we can for lack of a better term, mend that divide or create better pathways for knowledge transmission from the folks who self-identified pretty early, like my disability is viewable on a brain scan, to use my own example, versus somebody who's coming into it who may even have been disabled their entire life, but only had words for it at, to use your example, 17.
Yeah, and for myself, I was born with a genetic mutation, my connective tissue disability, and continually had medical issues my entire life, but we just figured I was a klutz. And it wasn't until I was 17 that everything kind of, came together. It is a very different experience to be born into systems and society that pathologize, ignore, speak for, and mistreat you, just as it's a different experience to suddenly have your world flipped upside down after acquiring a disability and to navigate this world of ableism, access needs, and grief. People who are born with disabilities have not experienced life without it. It's more inherent, whereas newly disabled people often have to go through that grieving process that I mentioned earlier, and they have to rebuild a sense of self and have a mind shift in medical and access awareness. They have to unlearn ableist views they held when it didn't affect them. I mean, I remember one of my biggest shocks was how heavy doors were, because suddenly the arthritis in my hand made it hard to open doors on my own. And that was not something that I had ever contemplated before, right? And respecting and understanding that people who've been living with disability their entire lives have knowledge and tricks and tools that could benefit newly disabled people. Lifelong disabled people, making room for the grief and culture shock that people with acquired disabilities experience as they learn about disability and history and the social model and cripness. I think it's creating purposeful spaces where people can share their stories and learn from each other, building community on-ramps for newly disabled people to help them adjust in gentle, caring ways, and validating their experiences. And lifelong disabled people can assure them that they're not the first to be experiencing these emotions and struggles and joys, and finding ways to offer that mutual aid and storytelling and peer support. And I think one of the things we really need to ask when tensions flare are, what value are you trying to protect?
Especially when it comes to the legal, obviously this episode is a companion to about the charter. It's really interesting seeing, you'll have to watch the episode, listeners, to dive into this, but that for some groups there was resistance to how it would be included in the charter. For some groups there was much more preference of and all people will be protected, as opposed to setting out what American advocates would call protected classes. And it's interesting to think about sort of the power that we protect.
To your earlier question about the top down and grassroots, grassroots disability organization is relational work that's about survival, and those most impacted by oppression are joining together to create that net that society likes to believe already exists. It's imagination and community and love in all its versions, and it challenges that myth that Canada has a safety net by showing what actually keeps people from falling through is that unpaid, unrecognized care work that's done by those already closest to the edge. And I think, this is where the power of disability justice comes in, because the limitations of grassroots organizing is also its power. It's led by those most impacted, right? And this is powerful because it's community help showing up for community. We know what it's like to be ignored and abused and mistreated, discriminated against, and we work hard to ensure that others don't have to feel that. Or if they do, they know that they're not alone or unloved. And I think that same most impacted leadership also means we're always organizing from a place of chronic fatigue and poverty and trauma and limited spoons. And we're fighting for our own housing and income and healthcare and safety at the same time that we're trying to support others, which can really make our work slower and messier and more precarious, because that labor is so personal and so close to our own survival. Burnout and turnover are real. And people disappear from organizing not because they don't care, but because they're in crisis. And I think this is where it's so important to think about how community shows up for community. And that's where I think the more we share stories like this, the more we show that divide does nothing to help the disability community, right? We are accountable first to the people who are hurting beside us, not to funders or political timelines. The limitation of not having that endless capacity or institutional Power keeps us rooted in like consent and boundaries and the reality that no one person or small group can fix all of the structural issues. It's why within disability justice, like interdependence and community care is so talked about. Our power is collective and our limits are a shared truth that we organize around rather than something we hide. And so I think it's really important to both recognize where there are divides, but also really work to lessen those divides.
I find sometimes in disability, people who are disability justice oriented can often end up doing advocacy work at the expense of their own health. This is not critique of the people that do that work. As a Crip Doula, how do you think we can teach people to, I don't like that this is a war metaphor, but step away from the front line of advocacy when they need it and identify that for themselves?
You know, sustainability is one of the principles of disability justice, and that sustainability is not just for the movement, it's for yourself. You know, the more you burn yourself out, the less you have to offer. And in the long run, that's not going to help anybody, especially when you already have health issues that probably are exacerbated by stress and fatigue. And so I know for myself, we just had our 20th anniversary celebration in October. Question I probably got the most in the lead up to it was, how have you lasted for 20 years without burning out? And I laughed because I haven't. I have burned out many, many, many times. But the thing is that, ironically, the thing that burns me out the most is also the thing that keeps me going. Like, it's people that burn me out the most. It's people that keep me going. And I think it's really trying to find community and not doing it on your own. My ability to have community to talk to vent to go to, I mean, you know, I screw up myself. I'm still learning about unlearning racism and ableism and, you know, all these different isms. And so I screw up. I need to have community to go to and be like, how do I address this? How am I accountable to this? And having that support matters. Like, there's no way I would have been able to do this without that community support. I think also, like, understanding that it isn't all on you. It feels like that. It feels like if I don't do this, no one else will. But there are ways that we can encourage other people. We can contact organizations with our ideas. I've done that many times where I've contacted them with an idea that's already kind of fully framed, saying like, I don't have the resources, whether it's financial or energy, to do this. Are you interested in taking this on? And, you know, sometimes that happens. So reaching out to other people, also being really kind to yourself. Like, a book I highly, highly suggest is Rest is Resistance by Tricia Hershey. I mean, anything by Tricia Hershey, but the Rest is Resistance is such a huge thing because not just disabled people, but very much disabled people, we feel like we have to earn our rest, you know? And I know that was one of the things I struggled with the most as someone with a disability. Was my taking a nap was not laziness. It was self-care. And I think self-care is shouted a lot within our society, but then when disabled people actually do what they need to do for themselves, whether that may be isolate themselves for a little bit to get over like sensory overwhelm, or, you know, when I was a kid, I used to come home from school and sit in my closet for an hour to come down from the overwhelm of the day. And I was very...
Floor time.
Yeah. It was my own sensory deprivation hut. And I was very privileged to live in a house where that wasn't shamed. I was allowed to do that. I was allowed to look after my own needs. I think we learn from such a young age that we're not allowed to look after our needs. I start all my workshops by saying that within this workshop, you have autonomy over yourselves. We are told that we have consent over ourselves, but then we are taught in large and small ways that we have to control our bodies, minds, and senses, and only meet our needs when given permission or at specific times. And the way that that non-consensual kind of atmosphere continues throughout our life, it means that when you have a disability, you do feel like you can't rest. You know, you can't give yourself permission to meet your own needs. And it's reinforced with society, which is very capitalistic, and another disability justice principle is anti-capitalistic.
Heather, I could talk to you for 5 or 6 hours. Unfortunately, we only had one.
Yeah.
But before we go, if people want to find more about your work, where can they go? Where can they find you? How can they get in touch?
Yeah, so our website is connectwithlets, LETS.org. And you can email us at hello@connectwithlets.org. And we're on Instagram and Facebook at Connect with Let's. We try to keep it simple to remember. And we have a newsletter, which you can join at the bottom of any of our website pages. And yeah, I'd love to hear from any listeners. And thank you very much for having me. I've enjoyed the conversation.
Thanks so much, Heather. Always a pleasure.
Thank you for tuning in to the companion podcast for AMI's History in 60. Be sure to watch History in 60 on AMI TV and online at AMI Plus. Join us next time as we continue exploring disability history and culture in Canada. If you enjoyed today's episode, please consider subscribing, downloading, and sharing it with someone who might learn from these stories. Every listen and view helps amplify disability history and the voices shaping change today.